A nurse no one remembered walked into a trauma bay no one could control and saved a life no one else could. She had no title, no allies. No one in that hospital even knew her real name. What they knew was this: she was quiet, she was forgettable, and she followed orders. What they didn't know was what nobody knew was that the woman they mocked as invisible had once carried soldiers out of burning buildings with her bare hands. Tonight, the arrogant surgeon who humiliated her in front of the entire staff was about to find out exactly who he'd been underestimating. If you want to know what happens when the most overlooked person in the room turns out to be the most dangerous, stay with me until the very end. Hit like, leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The storm came in off the coast without much warning. By 9:15 on a Tuesday night, the rain was hitting the windows of Harlow General Hospital in horizontal sheets, and the fluorescent lights in the trauma corridor were doing that thing they always did when the weather got bad, flickering just long enough to make everyone nervous, then holding. The kind of electrical behavior that maintenance had been promising to fix for 2 years. Nobody held their breath anymore. Mara Solis was restocking the supply cart in Trauma Bay 3 when the lights did it again. She didn't flinch. She'd stopped flinching at things like that a long time ago. 29 years old, 5'6", with a blonde ponytail pulled so tight it looked almost military, Mara had been working nights at Harlow General for just over 3 years. She knew every flickering bulb, every temperamental IV pump, every drawer that stuck in the supply room on the second floor. She knew which attending liked their patient updates and bullet points and which one needed you to walk them through it slowly or they'd miss something. She knew the janitor's schedule, the pharmacy's turnaround times on urgent requests, and the exact number of steps between the trauma bay and the crash cart. What she did not have was a reputation. That was intentional. "Solis," the voice came from behind her, clipped and impatient, the way it always was. "The intake chart on bed 7 is incomplete. Fix it." She turned. Dr. Garrett Hale, chief of trauma surgery, was already walking away before he finished the sentence, already looking at his phone, already thinking about something else. He was 44, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy authority that came from never once in his adult life having to wonder whether people would listen to him. They always did. He made sure of that. Mara pulled up the chart on the wall tablet without a word. It wasn't incomplete. She'd finished it 40 minutes ago. Someone had gone in and deleted a section, probably an accidental interface tap had happened. And now it looked like she'd never done it. She re-entered the data, didn't say anything about it. That was the other thing about Mara Solis. She had a very high tolerance for being wrong in the record when she'd been right in reality. It wasn't that she didn't notice. She noticed everything. She just operated on a different calculus than most people in that building, one where drawing attention to herself cost more than absorbing the small injustices. She'd spent enough years learning when to speak and when to go quiet. This was a quiet night, mostly. Bed 4 was a 63-year-old man named Wallace Pruitt. Retired, came in with chest pressure that had been building for 6 hours before his wife finally convinced him to stop timing it and get in the car. The ER had done a workup and handed him off to the trauma floor for monitoring. Mara had taken his vitals 3 times in the last 2 hours. The numbers were technically within acceptable ranges. Technically. She stood at the foot of his bed for a long moment, looking at the printout. The rhythm was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not wrong in a way that would set off alarms. But there was something in the pattern. A slight irregularity in the ST segment that the automated system had flagged with a low-priority notation and then essentially filed away. She'd seen something like it once, during her first year at Harlow, in a woman who'd coded 12 minutes later. Mara went to find Dr. Hale. She found him in the attending lounge, jacket off, eating what appeared to be a very late dinner of cold pad thai out of a takeout container. 2 residents were with him, listening to him talk about a procedure he'd done in Phoenix 8 years ago. They were nodding in the specific way people nodded when they were trying to look engaged, while also being slightly afraid. "Dr. Hale." She stopped in the doorway. "Mr. Pruitt in bed 4. I want to flag something on his rhythm strip." Hale looked up. The look he gave her was not hostile. It was something more particular than that. It was the look of a man who had already categorized her and didn't find the category interesting. "He's stable." He's technically within parameters, Mara said, but his ST elevation pattern has shifted in the last hour. I think it warrants a repeat troponin and a cardiology consult. One of the residents, a third year named Dominic, who was not a bad doctor but had very poor impulse control when it came to performing confidence, made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Hale set down his fork. Solis. Yes. What's his current pain level? He rates it a 4, but he's been minimizing since he came in. EKG flagged anything? Low priority notation, which is why I'm bringing it to you instead of waiting for an alarm. Hale looked at her for a moment. Then he said, with the specific patience of someone who found patience taxing, he's 63, mildly hypertensive, and he's been monitored for 2 hours without incident. The system would have caught a real pattern change. A pause. You're a nurse. You document concerns. You don't diagnose. I documented the concern, Mara said. I'm also telling you verbally. Noted. He picked his fork back up. He gets discharged at shift change if his numbers hold. That's the plan. She stood in the doorway for exactly 1 second longer than was comfortable. Then she left. Back at the nurses' station, she opened the chart for Wallace Pruitt and typed a detailed nursing note. Time-stamped, specific, clinical. ST segment. Observation. Subjective pain minimization. Recommendation for repeat troponin. Nursing request for cardiology consult declined by attending. She documented it the way she'd been taught to document things, as if someone would read it in a courtroom someday. Then she did something else. She pulled out her personal phone, stepped into the stairwell, and called a number she'd had saved under a contact labeled simply Tomas. Tomas Reyes had been a paramedic with Portland Fire Station 12 for 11 years. He and Mara had worked together on 4 different mass casualty drills and one very bad night involving a collapsed parking structure 2 years ago. They trusted each other the way people trusted each other when they'd made life-or-death calls together in bad lighting and had both turned out to be right. Hey, he answered on the second ring. You're working? Yeah, listen, I have a patient being discharged at shift change 63, retired, name's Wallace Pruitt, lives on Hendricks Avenue off the Morrison Bridge corridor. She gave him the address she had on file. His rhythm is doing something I don't like, and the attending overruled the concern. If you get a call from that address in the next 12 hours, I'll know what to look for, Thomas said. He didn't ask her to justify it. He never did. Nitro on standby. Thank you. She hung up and stood in the stairwell for a moment, listening to the rain. Then she went back to work. Heat. The shift had a particular texture on nights like this, not the violent chaos of a Friday in summer when the ER filled up with bar fights and motorcycle accidents and people making the worst decisions of their lives at high speed. Tuesday nights in a storm had a different quality. Slower in some ways, more grinding. The waiting room filled up with people who'd been putting off coming in and finally ran out of reasons, with elderly patients whose bodies had been sending polite distress signals for days, with the kind of fatigue-related injuries that happened when people pushed past their limits. Mara moved through it all with the particular economy of motion she'd developed over years that most people in that building didn't know about and wouldn't have believed if she'd told them. She'd enlisted at 19 Combat Medic 68W. Did her initial training at Fort Sam Houston, deployed twice, once to a forward operating base in a region she still didn't talk about at parties, once to a joint operation in an environment so chaotic that the field manual she'd memorized in training became essentially decorative within the first 72 hours. She'd kept soldiers alive on the ground with improvised equipment in conditions that would have stopped most people cold, making calls that weren't her rank to make because there was nobody else to make them, and people were dying. She'd come home and enrolled in nursing school. Nobody asked why. She didn't volunteer it. The transition from military medicine to civilian hospital work had been stranger than she expected. Not because the skills didn't transfer, but because the culture ran in almost the opposite direction. In the field, if you had information that could save a life, you used it. Rank mattered, but results mattered more. You improvised. You adapted. You made the call and owned it. In a hospital like Harlow General, you documented the call and waited to be overruled. She'd been adapting to that for 3 years. She was still adapting. At 11:40, she was in the middle of updating a post-procedural chart when the overhead PA system came to life with the tone she recognized before the words even started. Trauma alert, incoming multiple. MCI protocol activated. All available trauma staff report to bay staging level 1. Mara was already moving before the second sentence. What had happened she would piece together over the next hour from radio fragments and paramedic handoffs. A Metro Transit bus. The 47 line, running from the East Side Transit Center into downtown, had hydroplaned on the Burnside Bridge approach in the rain and gone broadside into a fuel delivery truck, making a late run. The truck hadn't exploded, which was the only reason this was a mass casualty event instead of a catastrophic fatality scene. But the impact had been significant enough to send the bus onto its side, trapping 17 passengers, and the fuel spill had triggered a secondary vehicle fire 40 feet from the wreckage. The first ambulance arrived at Harlow General at 11:52. By midnight, they had 11 patients in various stages of triage. By 12:15, they had 16. The trauma floor became a different place. Mara had seen mass casualty responses before. She'd helped coordinate one during her second year at Harlow, a smaller incident, manageable. She knew the shape of them, the initial surge of controlled frenzy, the moment when everyone's training either kicked in or it didn't. The particular quiet that settled over experienced staff when the noise got loud. The quiet wasn't calm exactly. It was more like compression. Everything narrowed to what was in front of you. She felt it settle over her now like something familiar. The charge nurse that night was a man named Phil Okoro, who was solid and experienced and currently managing 3 things at once with the expression of someone trying to do calculus on a moving train. Mara appeared at his elbow. Bay 3 and 5 are set up, she said. I've got 2 of the clinic nurses on chest injuries. Where do you want me? Phil looked at her for half a second, the half second of a man recalibrating who he was talking to. Bay 2, he said. Critical incoming. She went. Bay 2 was already populated with an attending named Dr. Yolanda Marsh, who Mara respected, and 2 residents who were managing their fear with varying degrees of success. On the gurney was a young woman, maybe 20, 22, slight build, dark hair matted with rain, and something darker, whose oxygen saturation was reading 84% and dropping. The paramedic who'd brought her in was in the middle of his handoff. Found her in the back of the bus, partial ejection through the window, suspected cervical injury, GCS has been fluctuating, tried 2 intubation attempts in the field, and couldn't establish airway. Mara was already at the head of the bed, pulling on gloves, looking at the girl's face, the angle of her neck, the way her chest was moving. Or not moving. Not moving right. Airway's compromised, she said. Not loud, just stated it. We see that, one of the residents said, with more edge than the situation warranted. Her neck is swollen on the left side, Mara continued. Trachea's deviated. This isn't just failed intubation. She's got something going on with the soft tissue. Standard airway is going to be a problem. Dr. Marsh had moved to the head of the bed as well and was looking at the same thing Mara was looking at. She's right, Marsh said briefly. What's her... The door to Bay 2 opened. Dr. Garrett Hale walked in. He had the look he always had when he was entering a room he intended to run. Jacket back on, shoulders set, gaze doing a quick sweep that somehow managed to communicate that he was assessing everything and found most of it slightly disappointing. He did this in normal situations. In a crisis, it was amplified. Where are we? He said to no one in particular, which meant to everyone. Dr. Marsh started the summary. Hale was already moving toward the head of the bed, already reconfiguring the space around him so that he was at the center of it. Mara stepped back. Not far, just enough. I'll manage the airway, Hale said. Get me a video laryngoscope. I don't think that's going to work, Mara said. Hale looked at her. The look was not angry yet. It was the preliminary look, the one that said, "Who let you speak?" The soft tissue swelling is severe enough that the angle is going to be extremely difficult, she said. I think she needs a surgical airway. Crick or surgical trach. She's 20 years old, Hale said. Yes. We don't go surgical on a 20-year-old until we've exhausted conventional approaches. 2 attempts were made in the field by paramedics. He said it in the tone of a man explaining something to someone who needed things explained. Hand me the laryngoscope. Mara handed it to him. She watched him attempt the intubation. She watched him fail. The girl's SATs dropped to 79. The monitor alarm started its insistent, ugly chirping. One of the residents said something, a clipped, urgent phrase, and Hale held up one hand in the universal gesture for, "I know, give me a second." He repositioned, tried again, 76. "Dr. Hale?" Dr. Marsh started. "I have it," he said. He didn't. 72. Mara looked at the girl's face, at the slight bluish tinge beginning at her lips, at the chest that was moving wrong, working too hard, failing at the basic arithmetic of oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. The girl's eyes were half open and unfocused, and there was something in the particular stillness of a person whose body was losing the argument. Mara had seen that stillness before, in different places, in different light. She knew what it meant, and she knew how long it lasted before it became permanent. "She needs a surgical airway," Mara said again. Her voice was level, not loud, just impossible to ignore. "Right now." Hale pulled back from his third failed attempt. His jaw was tight. He was breathing faster than he should have been, which was the tell. The thing that happened when the confident surgeon ran into the wall of what confidence couldn't fix. He looked at Mara. For a moment, the bay was almost quiet. The monitor still chirping, the rain still against the windows. Two residents frozen in their positions like people watching something they didn't know how to categorize. "You want to tell me how to do my job?" Hale said. Low, dangerous. "I want you to do your job," Mara said. "Right now, surgical airway. She has maybe 60 seconds. 68%. Something moved across Hale's face, something complicated and ugly, the specific expression of a man who was scared and furious about being scared and needed both of those things to go somewhere. He reached out and grabbed Mara's ponytail. Not roughly, which was almost worse. He did it with the deliberate, casual confidence of someone who had never in his life been made to think twice about touching someone who was in his way. He pulled her a step back from the patient. "You, stay, back." The room stopped. Everyone in Bay 2. Dr. Marsh, the two residents, the respiratory tech who'd just walked in with equipment, the nurse near the door. Everyone went absolutely still. Mara did not move. Not away, not toward him. She just stopped. Something in her face changed in a way that was hard to name. It wasn't anger exactly. It was more like a door closing, very quietly. The way a door closes when someone has made a decision. 64%. She said very calmly, "Let go." Hale's hand was still in her hair. What happened next took approximately 3 seconds and was later described by everyone present in slightly different ways, because human memory under stress is impressionistic. What they agreed on, Mara moved. There was no warning. There was no escalation. There was simply a shift in her center of gravity, a rotation, and a controlled application of force. And Dr. Garrett Hale, Chief of Trauma Surgery, 14 years of authority, 2 inches and 60 pounds on her, was on the floor. He wasn't hurt. She hadn't tried to hurt him. He was just down. Sitting on the Bay 2 floor with a look on his face that suggested he was struggling to understand the physics of what had just happened. Mara looked at him for exactly 1 second. "Touch me again," she said, "and we're done." Then she turned back to the patient. "Dr. Marsh," she said, "I need a 14-blade, a tracheal hook, and a size 6 cuffed trach tube. I need them in the next 30 seconds. There was a pause, the kind that happens when a room full of people is trying to catch up with a reality that moved faster than they did. Then Marsh moved to the supply cabinet. One of the residents moved. The respiratory tech moved. Hale was still on the floor, 61%. "Talk to me about her neck," Mara said, pulling on a fresh pair of gloves, positioning herself at the head of the bed with the economy of someone who had done this before. Not in a simulation lab, not in a controlled training scenario, but in conditions that made this look straightforward. Dr. Marsh was back with the supplies. "Left side hematoma. I'm thinking external compression of the upper airway." "Agreed. I'll go below it." Mara's hands were already palpating the neck, finding landmarks. "Can someone bag her? Keep whatever SATs we have." The resident named Dominic, who had been visibly recalculating something about the world, stepped up and started bagging. The power flickered, held, flickered again. And then the backup generator did what backup generators at Harlow General did in major weather events. It half kicked in, which meant the main lights died and the emergency lighting came on, red-tinted, low, casting everything in the particular palette of a situation that had stopped being theoretical. "Flashlight," Mara said. "Someone get a flashlight." She worked by the beam of a handheld surgical light that Marsh held steady above her, in red emergency lighting with improvised field adjustments to the standard procedure, because the suction unit was running at half capacity and she needed to compensate for what she couldn't see. The girl's name, they would find out later, was Cassidy Hale. 21 years old, second-year pre-med student at Portland State, Garrett Hale's daughter. None of them knew that yet. Mara didn't know that yet. She was working with what she had: a patient, a compromised airway, inadequate lighting, and the particular set of skills she'd spent years trying to keep invisible. The tracheal incision took 11 seconds. The tube went in clean. The monitor climbed, 63, 67, 72, 79. Dr. Marsh said quietly, "She's coming up." 86, 91, 94. The chirping changed pitch, steadied. Mara held the position for a moment, hands still, watching the number. Then she stepped back and stripped her gloves. She looked at the girl on the table, at the chest rising and falling with the right rhythm, finally, the right rhythm. And she felt the specific thing she always felt in these moments. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but something quieter and more durable. The feeling of a thing done right. Behind her, she heard Dr. Hale get up from the floor. She didn't turn around. "Get her to imaging," she said to Marsh. "I want to know what else we're dealing with." She walked toward the door of Bay 2. "Solis," Hale's voice. She stopped, hand on the doorframe. "That patient?" He stopped. Started again. Something in his voice was different, stripped of something. "What's her name?" Mara turned slightly. He was looking at the girl on the gurney with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not authority, not anger. Something broken open. The respiratory tech was checking the chart, reading. Then, "Hale, Cassidy Hale," while emergency contact listed as... The tech looked up. The room understood before Hale did. And then he understood. He walked to the side of the gurney, and whatever he did next, Mara didn't stay to watch. She was already back in the hallway, already moving, because there were 15 other patients on this floor, and the night wasn't close to over. But as she moved through the red-lit corridor, she became aware of something. She was being watched. Not the way she was usually watched, looked through, looked past, categorized and dismissed. This was different. The nurses near the station were watching her. One of the residents from Bay 2 was standing in the hall with an expression she couldn't quite read. Philocoro, the charge nurse, had turned from his position at the desk, and at the end of the corridor near the security checkpoint, a man in a gray shirt and a Harlow General badge was watching her with a very specific kind of attention. She'd seen that kind of attention before. It was the attention of someone who recognized something. She didn't know him, but something in the way he was looking at her, not surprised, not alarmed, but recognizing, made the back of her neck go tight. She kept walking. She had work to do. And somewhere across town, in an apartment on Hendricks Avenue, a 63-year-old retired man named Wallace Pruitt was sitting up in bed with a tightness in his chest that he'd been ignoring for 3 hours, while his wife finally picked up the phone to call 911. And on the other end of that emergency dispatch, Tomas Reyes was already in his rig, already knowing what he was going to find, already thinking about what Mara had told him 12 hours ago. The storm wasn't letting up. The lights in the corridor held, and the man in the gray shirt had taken out his phone and was looking at something on the screen, a photograph maybe, or a file, and then looking back up at Mara's retreating figure with the patient, certain expression of someone who had just found something they'd been looking for. The man in the gray shirt didn't follow her. That was the thing she kept turning over as she moved from bay to bay through the rest of that shift. He didn't follow her, didn't approach her, didn't do anything except stand at the end of that corridor with his phone in his hand and watch her walk away. which somehow felt more deliberate than if he had. She'd been watched before. Occupational hazard, military, and civilian both. She knew the difference between someone staring because she'd just thrown a surgeon onto a hospital floor, and someone staring because they knew something. This was the second kind. She was almost certain of it. She filed it away. There was too much else to manage. The MCI, mass casualty incident, in the clean bureaucratic language that turned catastrophe into acronym, was still running hot at 1 in the morning. The trauma floor had absorbed 16 patients in under an hour, and the system was showing the strain in the specific ways systems always showed strain. In the gaps, the small failures, the moments where the protocol didn't quite map onto the reality. A supply cart in the wrong position, a resident making a decision 2 beats too slow, a patient who'd been triaged green starting to drift toward yellow, while everyone's attention was pointed somewhere else. Mara caught that last one herself. A 40-something man named Derek, bus passenger, who'd been ambulatory at the scene and therefore assessed as low priority. She'd passed his bed twice, and something had snagged each time, some small wrongness she couldn't name until the third pass, when she stopped and looked at him properly. He was sitting up, answering questions in short sentences. His color was bad. "Derek," she said, "have you had any abdominal pain since you came in?" "Little bit." He said it the way men of a certain age said a little bit, meaning yes, considerable for a while. Scale of 1 to 10. Maybe a 5. He paused. 6. She palpated his abdomen. He made a sound that was not a 5 or a 6. She went to find Phil Okoro. "Bed 11, she said. "I think he's got internal bleeding. Seatbelt sign is faint, but it's there, and his pressure's been slowly dropping. Nobody caught it because the absolute number looked okay." Phil looked at his board. His triage was, I know what his triage was. Phil looked at her, then at the board. Then he called for a surgical consult. Derek went to the OR 40 minutes later with a grade 2 splenic laceration. Stable. They caught it. Mara didn't tell anyone she'd caught it. She updated the chart and moved on. That was the rhythm of the night. Not heroic, not clean, just continuous. One thing, and then the next thing. Moving through the red-tinted corridors with the emergency lighting still holding because the main power was still doing its on-again, off-again routine. Working with whatever was available. Making the calls that needed to be made. She didn't see Hale again until almost 2 in the morning. Troptek. He was in the family consultation room off the main trauma corridor. She could see him through the narrow window in the door as she passed. Sitting in one of the chairs that were specifically designed to be supportive without being comfortable, because the hospital's interior designer had apparently believed that grief should be managed in a chair with good lumbar support. He was hunched forward, elbows on his knees, and for the first time in 3 years he looked like something other than the chief of trauma surgery. He looked like a father. His daughter was out of immediate danger. Marsh had updated the floor. Cassidy Hale had been moved to the ICU, sedated, and while the road ahead was complicated, the airway was the thing that would have killed her, and the airway was handled. She was alive because of a decision made in under 60 seconds by someone Hale had spent the better part of 3 years treating like background noise. Mara didn't slow down when she passed the window. She had no interest in watching his crisis, but she noticed that Dr. Marsh was standing just outside the consultation room door, back against the wall, and when Mara passed, Marsh reached out briefly and touched her arm. Not grabbing, just a touch. A kind of acknowledgement that didn't have words attached to it. Mara nodded once and kept moving. The storm had pulled back slightly by 2:30. Not gone, but reconfigured into a steady heavy rain instead of the lateral assault it had been earlier. Through the windows at the end of the corridor, Portland looked the way it always looked in bad weather. Dark and wet and faintly beautiful, the bridge lights smearing yellow across the river. She was at the nurse's station updating a chart when Phil appeared beside her. "You doing okay?" he said. It wasn't a question he usually asked her. He was a good charge nurse, competent and fair, but they operated in parallel rather than in conversation. She'd always understood that was partly her doing. "I'm fine," she said. "That was—" He stopped. Started again. "What happened in Bay 2? A lot of people saw that." "I know. Security's going to want a statement." "I know that too." He stood there for a moment, then, The way you went in on that airway. Where did you learn to do that? She kept her eyes on the chart. Continuing education. Phil made a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite disbelief. Something in between. Right, he said, and walked away. She'd known the question was coming. She'd been knowing it was coming since the moment she stepped back from Cassidy Hale's bedside. The thing about staying invisible is that it works until it doesn't, and when it stops working, it stops all at once. She'd done too many visible things in the last 2 hours to put the wall back up tonight. She'd just have to manage what came next. What came next arrived at 3:17 in the form of a knock on the break room door. She was in there alone, 5 minutes, cup of bad coffee, the specific kind of solitude that night shift nurses understood as medicine, when the knock came. She said, "Come in," and the door opened, and the man in the gray shirt stepped into the room. Closer now. Late 50s, maybe early 60s. Brown skin, gray at the temples, a face that had done a lot of being still in difficult situations and had the lines to show it. The badge read D. Mercer. Security. The way he carried himself read something older and more specific than hospital security. "Ms. Solis," he said, "you have a few minutes?" "I have about 4, she said. "I need to be back on the floor." He nodded and sat down across from her without being invited, which told her something. "I'm Daniel Mercer. I'm the security chief here." He paused. "Before that, I was CID, Army Criminal Investigation." She held her coffee cup and looked at him. "I know who you are," he said. "Not Mara Solis. Or not just that." The break room was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor was alarming softly and then not alarming. "What do you want?" she said. "Nothing bad," Mercer said. He said it simply, without the reassuring warmth people usually deployed when they were about to say something difficult. She appreciated that. "I recognized you about a year ago, actually. Took me a while to be sure. You've changed how you look some." "People do." "They do?" He leaned forward slightly. "I was at Fort Bragg when you were attached to the 75th. I didn't know you directly, but I knew your work. The stuff from the second deployment." She said nothing. "There were 3 soldiers who came home who shouldn't have," Mercer said, "because of calls you made under conditions that weren't survivable by most standards. I read the after-action reports." A pause. "The ones that were declassified anyway." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because what you did tonight in Bay 2 is going to come out," he said. "And when it does, people are going to ask who you are. And you can let them find out the hard way, through whatever fragments they dig up, or you can be ahead of it." Mara put her coffee down. "Dr. Hale assaulted me. I defended myself and then I did my job. That's the entire story." "That is the story," Mercer agreed, "but it's not all of it, and you know it." She looked at him for a long moment. This was the thing she'd been managing for 3 years, the specific calculation of how much to reveal and when, and the consistent answer being as little as possible, as late as possible. She'd built a life around that answer, a quiet life, a life where she could do the work without the weight of other people's expectations about what she was supposed to be. "The footage from Bay 2, she said finally. "What does it show?" "Everything," Mercer said. "High resolution, multiple angles. His hand in your hair, the takedown, your statement, all of it." He paused. "It also shows you performing that surgical airway with no power, no proper suction, by flashlight, a procedure that isn't in the standard nursing scope. It's in the military scope." "Yes," he said. "It is." She stood up. 4 minutes was up. "I'm going back to the floor." "I know." He didn't move to stop her. "Solis, the footage is already being reviewed by hospital administration. This isn't something that gets managed quietly, not with 16 witnesses and a chief of surgery on the floor." He said it without judgment, just fact. "I wanted you to know before the morning shift shows up, and it becomes a different kind of conversation." She stopped at the door. "What happens to him?" "That depends on a lot of things," Mercer said, "including what you decide to do." She pushed the door open and went back to work. 4 in the morning had its own specific quality in a hospital after a mass casualty event. The acute crisis had metabolized into something more chronic, the work of stabilization, of monitoring, of making sure the patients who'd survived the first hours kept surviving through the next ones. The residents were running on cortisol and stubbornness. The attending who'd been called in for backup, a woman named Dr. Priya Anand, was moving through the floor with the quiet efficiency of someone who saved her adrenaline for when it was strictly necessary. Mara was in the middle of a medication reconciliation for one of the ICU transfers when she heard it. A child's voice, high, frightened, cutting through the low-frequency hum of the floor like something sharp. She tracked it to Bay 6, which had been cleared of MC1 patients an hour ago, and was now holding a 6-year-old boy named Marcus, who'd come in separately, brought in by his grandmother, no MCI connection, a fever that had been climbing for 2 days and had just crossed 104. He'd been assessed and was waiting for a pediatric consult that was delayed because the pediatric resident on call was currently managing 2 other cases from the bus accident. The boy was seizing. The grandmother was standing at the bedside, both hands pressed to her mouth, making a sound that wasn't words. Mara was in the bay in 4 steps. She went to Marcus's side, turned him onto his recovery position, called out clearly into the corridor for a crash cart and pediatric emergency, checked his airway, checked his color. He's been sick since Sunday, the grandmother managed. They said it was just a virus. They said, "I hear you," Mara said. It came out steady, not performed. "What's his name?" "Marcus. His name is Marcus." "Marcus." She kept her hands on him, monitoring the seizure duration, watching his color, running the possibilities in parallel with the actions. Febrile seizure, bacterial meningitis, encephalitis, the fever, the duration, the way it had escalated. She needed labs. She needed imaging. She needed a pediatrician in this room in the next 3 minutes. Dr. Anand came in at a near run with a resident behind her. Mara gave the handoff in 7 sentences. Everything relevant, nothing extra, and stepped back to give them room. The grandmother caught her arm as she moved toward the door. "Are you the one who—" She stopped. "Someone told me. They said a nurse saved a girl tonight. The one from the crash." "A lot of people saved people tonight," Mara said. "Was it you?" She looked at the woman's face, 60-something, still in her house slippers because she'd come straight from home, eyes red from crying and not sleeping, the kind of love that showed up in whatever shoes it had on. "Go be with him," Mara said gently. "He needs to hear your voice." She went back to the corridor. The sky outside the windows at the end of the hall had shifted, almost imperceptibly, from black to the deep blue-gray that meant 4:30, 5 o'clock, the particular color of a night that had almost finished. The rain had settled into something fine and steady, more mist than rain, softening the lights on the bridge. Marcus's seizure resolved. He was moved to pediatric ICU for bacterial workup. The grandmother had hold of his hand before the gurney was through the door. At 5:40, the day shift started arriving. This was usually the most uncomplicated part of Mara's night. The handoff, the end, the walk to the parking structure and the drive home, and the specific crash of sleep that came after a hard shift. She was good at the transition, good at leaving the hospital in the hospital. Tonight was different, and she knew it before the first day shift nurse came through the door. She could feel it in the way the overnight staff was moving, the small extra seconds people took when passing her, the slightly adjusted trajectories, the glances that held a beat longer than they needed to. Word had moved through the building the way word moved through buildings, through break rooms and supply closets, and the spaces between official channels. By the time the morning staff arrived, the outline of the story was already circulating, imprecise in the details and accurate in the emotional core. There was a nurse. There was a surgeon. Something happened that shifted whatever axis the floor had been tilting on. Phil Okoro did the handoff briefing, and when he got to Bay 2, he said what had happened with the kind of factual flatness that was somehow louder than drama. Surgical airway performed by nursing staff. Patient survived. Incident involving attending physician. Security review underway. He didn't look at Mara when he said it, but everyone else did. She was standing near the back of the group in her usual position, slightly apart, slightly behind the main cluster, the position she'd occupied for 3 years because it was the easiest place to be unseen, except that it wasn't working tonight. The eyes kept finding her. She was pulling on her jacket, about to leave, when she heard Hale's voice in the corridor. He'd been here all night. Of course he had. His daughter was in the ICU. He came down the corridor toward the nurse's station, looking like a man who'd gone through something he couldn't process yet. Clothes slightly wrong, the particular dishevelment of a person who hasn't been home, who's been sitting in a room measuring time in the rhythms of a monitor. He stopped when he saw her. The people around them did the thing people did when they sensed a charged interaction. A slight clearing, a peripheral awareness, the pretense of being very busy with other things. Hale and Mara stood about 10 feet apart. He said nothing for a moment, then, "She's stable." He said it like he was reporting to someone, like he needed to say it out loud to make it real. "I heard," Mara said. Another pause. He looked older than he had 12 hours ago. Not physically older, just depleted in a way that had something to do with the particular piece of armor that had come off in Bay 2. The piece that had told him, for 44 years, that he was the most important person in most rooms. "I need to say something to you," he said. His voice had lost the timbre it usually had, that resonant, carrying quality that filled conference rooms and commanded trauma bays. What was left was just a voice. "And He stopped. "I'm not going to be good at it." "You don't have to." "No." Firm, not aggressive. "I do." He looked at her directly, which was the most disconcerting thing he'd done so far. "What I did in that bay was, I had no right. And the things I said to you, not just tonight," he exhaled through his nose, "the 3 years of dismissing you, speaking to you the way I did, that was unprofessional," Mara said. It wasn't a concession. It was just the precise word. "Yes," he said. "And worse." She held his gaze. She wasn't going to make it easier for him, and she wasn't going to make it harder. She wasn't going to perform forgiveness she hadn't gotten to yet, and she wasn't going to deliver a verdict she hadn't examined properly. "Your daughter is alive," she said finally. "So is the man in bed 4 who you discharged. Tomas Reyes from Portland Fire, Station 12. He reached him in time." She paused. "I called ahead. Last night." Hale stared at her. "You called a paramedic? For a patient I'd discharged." "I called in a concern," she said, "because I had one and no one would address it through the proper channel." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something had settled in his face that hadn't been there before. Not peace, nothing as simple as that, but the beginning of a reckoning. The look of a man who has begun to understand the full scope of what he's gotten wrong. He opened his mouth to say something else, and that was when the door at the end of the corridor opened and 2 people walked in who were not medical staff. One was a woman in her 40s in a business blazer, with the particular posture of someone from administration who had been awake for several hours and had already made several phone calls that she had not enjoyed making. The other was a man in a suit, younger, with a portfolio under his arm, and the very deliberate neutral expression of someone who had been trained in how to deliver news without revealing which way it was going to land. They were looking for Hale, and behind them, walking at a slight distance as though he'd been part of the group but had chosen not to be, was Daniel Mercer. He caught Mara's eye from across the corridor and gave her a look that communicated several things at once, none of which were reassuring. Whatever was coming, it was coming now. Hale had turned toward the approaching group with the body language of a man bracing for something he'd known was on its way. He shot one more look at Mara, not asking for anything, she thought, just looking, and then squared his shoulders and walked toward them. Mara watched him go. She was still watching when Mercer detached from the group and walked over to her. He stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets, and spoke quietly. "Hospital board convened an emergency session at 5 a.m., he said. "They've reviewed the footage. All of it." A pause. "There are also 3 formal complaints filed overnight. 2 from residents who were in Bay 2, 1 from Dr. Marsh. Not against you, against him." "How many people know?" she asked, about the other part, the part she'd told him in the break room. "Right now, me, and whoever ran the background check the board authorized 2 hours ago." He looked at her steadily. "They found your service record." She exhaled slowly. "Mara." It was the first time he'd used her first name. "What happens next is going to be loud, whether you want it or not." Down the corridor, the woman in the blazer had placed a hand on Hale's arm and was speaking to him in the low, clear tone of official consequence. He was standing very still. The man with the portfolio was writing something. Mercer said, almost to himself, he built a 14-year career on nobody questioning him. I know, Mara said. You could have reported him a dozen times. Documentation doesn't always work the way it's supposed to. No, he agreed. It doesn't. He turned to look at her properly. But footage does. She picked up her bag from the chair near the nurse's station. The day shift was fully installed now, the overnight crew filtering out in ones and twos, the building shifting into its daytime register. Somewhere in the ICU, Cassidy Hale was sedated and breathing through a tube that Mara had placed in the dark. Somewhere across town, Wallace Pruitt was probably eating a hospital breakfast and telling his wife he felt better, not fully understanding how close it had been, not knowing the name of the person who'd made sure someone was coming for him. The boy Marcus's grandmother was probably still holding his hand. Mara started toward the exit. She got almost to the end of the corridor before she heard her name. Not from Mercer, not from Hale, not from any of the people who'd been watching her all night. It was Dominic, the third-year resident, the one who'd made the sound in the break room when she first flagged Pruitt, the one who'd frozen for a moment in Bay 2 before he started bagging Cassidy Hale. He was standing near the exit, jacket on, clearly also headed out. He looked like he'd been awake for 22 hours, which he had. He looked like someone who had spent those 22 hours adjusting something internal. Hey, he said. Not smooth. A little awkward. I've been thinking about what to say since about 1 a.m. She waited. In the lounge. When I kind of laughed at your concern about Pruitt. He was looking at the floor, and then at her, and then at the floor. You were reading the room, Mara said. I was being a coward, he said, flat, honest. And if you'd been wrong, which I was pretty sure you would be, then I had some cover. And if you'd been right, he stopped. Anyway, I was wrong. About all of it. He met her eyes. I just wanted to say that. She looked at him for a moment. 27, maybe 28, still young enough for this to actually change something. Get some sleep, she said. She pushed through the exit door into the gray morning air. The rain had almost stopped. The parking structure was wet and quiet and smelled like concrete and exhaust, the ordinary smell of a place where nothing dramatic had ever happened. Her car was on the 3rd level, and as she took the stairs, elevator was slow and she needed to move. She was running a calculation she'd been avoiding since the break room conversation with Mercer. The service record was out. That was done. She couldn't unring that bell. What it would mean for the job, for the specific version of quiet she'd constructed here, for the careful invisibility that had been the operating principle of her last 3 years, she didn't know yet. She'd know by end of week, probably. These things moved fast once they started moving. She reached the 3rd level and pushed through the door into the open deck. Her car was where she'd left it. She was 10 feet away from it when she heard footsteps behind her, coming through the same stairwell door. She turned. It wasn't Mercer. It wasn't anyone from the hospital. It was a woman she'd never seen before. Mid-40s, expensive coat, the specific tension of someone who had driven somewhere and had a purpose that wasn't going to wait for a better moment. She had Garrett Hale's nose and jawline, or maybe it was the other way around, and she was looking at Mara with an expression that contained several things at once. You're the nurse, she said. The one who... She couldn't finish the sentence. Her voice had a quality that told Mara she'd been crying in the car. I'm a nurse, Mara said carefully. Yes. Cassidy's my daughter. The woman's hands were clasped in front of her tight. Garrett called me at 2 a.m. He told me... He said there was a nurse and she stopped again. He said he owed you an apology that he didn't know how to give, and that I should... Her voice broke slightly and she held it together by force. I drove here from the coast, 3 hours. I needed to see you. Mara stood in the damp, concrete quiet of the parking deck. She's going to be okay, the woman said. That's what they're telling me. She is, Mara said. She had a strong recovery once the airway was established. The woman, Cassidy's mother, reached out and touched Mara's hand. Just for a moment, just that. Then she said, "He told me what he did. To you. In that room." Mara said nothing. "He told me the truth," the woman said, "which Garrett doesn't do that easily." She exhaled. "I don't know what's going to happen next for him. I don't know what should happen, but I know what you did." She squared herself. "I won't forget it." She turned and walked back through the stairwell door. Mara stood alone on the deck for a moment. Then she got into her car, started the engine, and pulled out onto the ramp toward the exit. The gray morning light was coming through the windshield, the city still wet and quiet in the early hour. She was tired in the way she was always tired after a bad night. Not just physically, but in some layer underneath that, the one that absorbed everything she didn't react to in the moment. She was 3 blocks from the hospital when her phone buzzed. The contact reading, Tomas. She answered it on speaker. "Pruitt's in Portland General right now," Tomas said. He sounded like he'd been awake all night too. "Cardiac cath lab. They're saying he would have been dead by morning." "How is he?" "Going to need a stent, but alive." A pause. "Mara, the paramedic who caught it. That was me. I was the one who..." He stopped. "The ER doc asked me how I knew to prioritize the call. I told her the truth, that a nurse at Harlow flagged it." She waited. "They're going to want to know your name," he said. "The doc, the family, maybe the hospital." The traffic light ahead turned red. She stopped. Through the windshield, the Burnside Bridge was visible in the distance, where the bus had gone over, where the night had started, where 16 people had arrived at Harlow General, and most of them were going to go home. The bridge lights were still on, glowing amber through the mist. "Let me think about it," she said. "Okay," Tomas said. And then, "For what it's worth, you did right tonight." She said goodbye and put the phone down. The light turned green. She didn't move. Behind her a car waited, then politely tapped its horn. She pulled forward, and 2 blocks behind her, in the Harlow General parking structure, a second car that had been idling on level 3 since before she arrived pulled out and followed the same route, unhurried, maintaining distance, the kind of following that didn't look like following unless you'd been trained to notice it. Mara checked her mirror. She noticed. She drove 2 blocks and pulled into a bus stop, not panicking, just thinking. The car behind her, a dark gray sedan, mid-range, nothing distinctive, had made the same left turn she had off Morrison, which could mean nothing. Portland had left turns. People made them. She pulled out slowly and took an unnecessary right onto a one-way street that didn't go anywhere useful. The sedan didn't follow. She sat for a moment with the engine running, watching the mirror. Nothing. Just the rain-slicked street and a delivery truck idling outside a bakery that was already running its ovens at 6 in the morning, the smell of it reaching her even through the closed windows. She was more tired than she'd realized. That was the problem with this level of fatigue. It started producing patterns that weren't there. She'd been awake for 22 hours. She'd performed emergency surgery by flashlight. She'd thrown her attending onto a linoleum floor and then had 3 separate conversations that rewired something in her understanding of what the next phase of her life was going to look like. Of course, she was seeing ghosts in traffic. She put the car in drive and went home. She slept 4 hours. Not well, but enough. When she woke up, there were 11 missed calls, 3 from a number she didn't recognize, which turned out to be Harlow General's HR department, 2 from Phil Okoro, 1 from Tomas, 1 from a 503 number that resolved, when she looked it up, to the Oregon State Board of Nursing, and 4 from a number saved in her phone as Lieutenant Hargrove, JAG, a contact she hadn't dialed in over 2 years and hadn't expected to hear from again. She lay on her back looking at the ceiling for approximately 30 seconds. Then she got up, made coffee, and called Phil first. "They want you in at noon," he said. He sounded like he hadn't slept at all. "Administration, not HR, the actual executive suite, CEO's office." "What for?" "Officially, incident review." A pause. "Unofficially, I think they've been on the phone with the board's legal counsel since 5 a.m., and they're trying to figure out what they have." Another pause, shorter. "Mara, the footage went to the board chair at 6. All of it, including the airway." She drank her coffee. Who authorized that? Mercer. She thought about that. Mercer, who had told her it was coming regardless. Mercer, who had spent his career in an institution that moved on evidence and who understood that evidence had its own momentum once released. Okay, she said. There's something else. Phil's voice shifted, more careful now, navigating something. The residents. Dominic and the other one, Kayla. They've both filed formal written statements this morning, independent statements, about what they witnessed in Bay 2. He stopped. So has Dr. Marsh and the respiratory tech. And he stopped again. Phil. Hale submitted a statement too, he said. Voluntary. His counsel apparently advised against it, and he did it anyway. A pause. I don't know what's in it, she set her mug down. Outside her apartment window, Portland was doing what it did after a storm. The sky a washed, tentative blue. Everything wet and slightly clarified. The city looking briefly like a city that had been cleaned. She'd lived here for 4 years and she still wasn't used to the way it looked after rain. I'll be there at noon, she said. Oh. She wore her navy blazer, not a power move, just the thing she put on when she needed to be taken seriously and wasn't in scrubs. She'd learned that lesson early, in uniform and out of it. Presentation was information, and you could choose what information to give. The executive suite at Harlow General was on the 6th floor, and it had the specific aesthetic of institutional money. Not lavish, but deliberate. Clean lines, neutral colors, the kind of furniture that said we made considered decisions without saying anything as explicit as we spent a lot. The CEO, a woman named Sandra Voigt, was at the head of the conference table with 2 people from legal and 1 from HR and Daniel Mercer, who was sitting slightly apart from the others in a way that was either coincidence or position. Voigt was 60, direct, and had the look of someone who had managed crises before and found them clarifying rather than overwhelming. She gestured to the chair across from her. Ms. Solis, sit down, please. Mara sat. We're going to be straightforward with you, Voigt said. We've reviewed the footage from Bay 2. We've read the statements from Dr. Marsh, the residents, and Mr. Mercer. We are aware of your military service record, which was provided to us through appropriate channels this morning. She folded her hands on the table. We're also aware that you spent the remainder of last night's shift managing 2 additional critical interventions, the splenic laceration in bed 11 and the pediatric patient in Bay 6, after the incident. That was my job, Mara said. Yes. Voigt looked at her with something that wasn't quite a smile. About that. She opened a folder. Your nursing scope here at Harlow General does not include surgical airway procedures. You performed one anyway. I need to understand your clinical reasoning. The patient was at 61% oxygen saturation and dropping. 3 intubation attempts had failed. The anatomy was compromised by hematoma. Surgical airway was the correct intervention, and there was no one else in that bay prepared to perform it. Dr. Hale had failed 3 times and was not in a position to proceed effectively. Voigt held her gaze. You've performed that procedure before. Yes. In a military context. Yes. How many times? Mara considered the question for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because it was the kind of answer that landed differently depending on how the room was reading her. 11, she said, under field conditions. 0 patient deaths attributable to the procedure. The lawyer to Voigt's left wrote something down. The HR person hadn't moved since Mara sat down. Mercer was watching the table. Ms. Solis, Voigt said, we are not here to discipline you for the airway procedure. I want to make that clear. She paused. We are here because a physician on this staff committed a physical assault in a clinical environment, on camera, in front of 6 witnesses, and this institution needs to understand the full context of everything that occurred in that bay before we determine how to proceed. What do you need from me? A formal statement, your account of the events, starting from the moment you raised the concern about Mr. Pruitt. She gave it, all of it, 15 minutes, chronological, clinical, where it needed to be clinical, and specific where it needed to be specific. She didn't editorialize and she didn't minimize. When she got to the moment in Bay 2 when Hale grabbed her hair, she described it in the same register she'd used for everything else. Factual, precise, without dramatic weight, and watched the lawyer's pen move steadily across the page. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Voight said, "Doctor, Hale has voluntarily surrendered his admitting privileges pending review." Mara absorbed that. "His statement," Voight continued, "confirmed your account in full, including the discharged patient, the overruled nursing concern, and the physical contact." She paused. "He also requested that his statement include an acknowledgement that your intervention saved his daughter's life." His words. "His daughter being my patient doesn't change the standard of care," Mara said. "No," Voight agreed. "It doesn't." She closed the folder. "But it does change him." She looked at Mara for a moment with the particular attention of someone reading something more complex than what was on the surface. "You documented every concern, every overruled recommendation, 3 years of time-stamped specific nursing notes." "I did. You knew this might matter someday." "I hoped it wouldn't need to," Mara said honestly, "but I documented it anyway." Voight nodded once, the nod of someone who understood that answer completely. "We're going to need you to be available for the formal investigation, the medical board, and potentially," she glanced at the lawyer, "other parties." "Other parties," Mara said. "The district attorney's office has been in contact with hospital counsel regarding the physical assault footage," the lawyer said. It was the first thing he'd said. He said it in the flat, careful tone of someone reading from an internal memo. "We are not in a position to discuss that aspect of the case at this time." The room had shifted. She could feel it. Not a change in the temperature or the light, but in the weight of what was being said and what wasn't being said. This had moved past an internal HR matter in the last few hours, and everyone in the room understood that. Mara stood. "I'll be available." "One more thing," Voight said. Mara waited. "The nursing staff. The ones who've worked nights with you for the last 3 years." Voight looked at her directly. 8 of them have submitted unsolicited statements to HR this morning about the general culture on the trauma floor, about incidents over the past 3 years involving Dr. Hale. She paused. "Your situation gave them a framework, something to attach their own accounts to." Mara said nothing. "You weren't the only one," Voight said. "You were just the first one with footage." She left the executive suite and took the stairs down instead of the elevator, because she needed the 6 floors to think. 8 nurses, 3 years of incidents, 8 people who had been sitting on their own documentation, their own memories, their own versions of the same calculation she'd run every time she decided the cost of speaking up was higher than the cost of absorbing it and moving on. The stairwell was concrete and fluorescent lit and smelled faintly of industrial cleaner, and she stood on the 3rd-floor landing for a moment with her hand on the railing. She had not set out to be the person who broke something open. She had set out to do her job, go home, and keep the walls up. The walls were down now, in a way she couldn't reconstruct, and she was trying to decide whether to grieve that or not. She decided not. Not yet. She pushed through the 3rd-floor door and came out near the ICU wing, which was where she hadn't intended to go, but where she was now, so she kept walking. Cassidy Hale was in room 4, still sedated, a ventilator managing her breathing through the trach tube. Her trach tube, the one Mara had placed at 600 minutes into the worst shift of the year. The room was visible through the glass, and through the glass Mara could see the equipment, the lines, the numbers on the monitor, everything holding. She wasn't going to go in. There was no clinical reason to go in. She was off shift. She was not this patient's assigned nurse. She was a woman in a navy blazer standing in an ICU corridor with no professional purpose here. She stood there for 30 seconds anyway. Then she heard a voice from the room across the hall. A child's voice. Familiar. Marcus. She turned. Room 7. The boy was awake, propped up on pillows, with the particular expression of a child who has been sick long enough to understand that being in a hospital is not the worst thing but is still pretty bad. His grandmother was in the chair beside him, same house slippers, holding his hand. The grandmother looked up and saw Mara through the glass. She got up and came to the door. "You're the one from last night," she said. She said it with certainty, not question. "I was there," Mara said. The woman looked at her for a long moment, the same way Cassidy Hale's mother had looked at her in the parking structure, not with hero worship, nothing that simple, but with the specific kind of attention that came from someone whose world had almost been much smaller and smaller in a permanent direction. "He's going to need IV antibiotics for another week," the woman said. "They told me this morning." "That's right. Bacterial meningitis responds well with early treatment." Early. She said the word like she understood everything it contained. "You found it early." Mara looked at the boy in the bed. He had a cartoon on the TV mounted to the wall and was watching it with the detached focus of someone who had learned in the last 12 hours that paying attention to cartoons was actually a pretty reasonable use of time. "He found it," Mara said, "by seizing in a room with people who could respond." The grandmother made a small sound. "You have a funny way of not taking credit." Mara almost said something about training, about protocol, about the way the system was supposed to work when it worked. But what came out instead was, "I'm glad he's watching TV." She walked back toward the stairwell. She was 3 rooms from the ICU exit when her phone buzzed. Not a call. A text from Mercer. "Board meeting moved to 4 p.m. They're voting on Hale's status tonight. You should know. His legal team filed a motion this morning to have the Bay 2 footage excluded from the internal review. Cited chain of custody." She read it twice. Then she typed back, "On what grounds?" 3 seconds. "They're arguing the footage was shared externally. To me, then to the board, without a formal release authorization. They're calling it a procedural violation." She stood in the corridor outside the ICU with the phone in her hand, running the logic of it. If the footage was excluded from the internal review, the formal disciplinary case rested on witness statements only, which were substantial. 6 people, independent, consistent. But without the footage, Hale's legal team had room to construct a narrative, to suggest confusion, stress, misremembered sequence of events in the chaos of an MCI, to turn 6 accounts into a he said, she said at scale. She typed, "What about the DA?" Mercer's response took longer this time. When it came, it was 4 words. "That's the other thing." And then, before she could respond, "There's a detective in the lobby. She's been here since 11. She's not here for Hale." Mara went very still. She showed up with a federal badge, asked for you by name. A pause. "Your real name, Mara, not Solis." The ICU exit door was 10 feet away. The elevator bank was 20 feet in the other direction. The stairwell that led to the lobby was at the end of the corridor. She looked at her phone. Then she looked up. At the end of the ICU corridor near the stairwell door, a woman in a dark jacket was standing with the specific stillness of someone who had been waiting long enough to have already decided how this conversation was going to begin. She wasn't hospital staff. Her badge was clipped to her belt, not her jacket, the federal carry position. And she had the particular patience of someone who spent her professional life knowing that the people she needed to talk to eventually had to come through the same door. Their eyes met across 40 feet of ICU corridor. The woman didn't move toward her. She just waited. And Mara understood, with the cold clarity of someone who had spent years watching for exactly this kind of moment, that the question was no longer whether her past was going to catch up with her. The question was what it wanted when it did. She walked toward the woman, not because she had to, because she'd spent 3 years letting things come to her on other people's terms, and she was done with that particular posture. If this was happening, she was going to be the one who closed the distance. The woman in the dark jacket didn't move until Mara was 10 feet away, and then she extended a hand. Not a badge, just a hand. "Special Agent Diane Rourke," she said. "DHS, Office of Inspector General." She said it quietly, the way people said things in hospital corridors when they understood that the environment required it. Mara shook her hand. "This isn't about last night." "No," Rourke said. "It isn't." They found an empty family consultation room 2 doors down, different from the one Hale had been sitting in at 2 in the morning, smaller, with a window that looked out onto the parking structure instead of the courtyard. Rourke sat across from her with a thin folder and the specific stillness of someone who had rehearsed the shape of this conversation without knowing exactly how it would go. "I want to be clear about why I'm here before you decide how much to say," Rourke began. "I'm not investigating you. You're not a subject. You're not a person of interest. And this conversation is voluntary. You can stop it at any point." "Okay," Mara said. "What I'm about to tell you is going to feel like it comes from a different direction than you expect," Rourke said. She opened the folder. Inside was a single photograph as a man, 50s, military bearing softened by civilian clothes, photographed at a distance in what looked like an airport. Do you recognize this individual? Mara looked at the photo for 4 seconds. No. His name is Colonel Warren Steck, retired as of 14 months ago. He was the commanding officer of the joint operation you were attached to during your second deployment. A pause. The classified one. The consultation room was very quiet. The parking structure outside the window was doing its ordinary business. Cars moving, a delivery van maneuvering, nothing watching her this time. Steck is currently under federal investigation, Rourke said, for a range of issues that I can't fully detail, but which include the suppression of after-action reports from 2 specific incidents during that deployment. She looked at Mara directly. Incidents in which the official record reflects outcomes that don't match the field accounts of several personnel who were present. Mara held very still. You were one of those personnel, Rourke said, and based on what we've been able to piece together, your departure from military service was encouraged, in ways that weren't reflected in your official separation paperwork. 3 years. 4 years. The shape of a decision she'd thought was hers and had always felt slightly wrong, like a bone that healed at a degree off from where it should have been. What do you need from me? Mara said. A voluntary statement about what you witnessed during the second deployment, specifically the 2 incidents. Rourke closed the folder. I know that's not a small ask. No. I know you built something here that required staying quiet about it. I built something here that required staying quiet about a lot of things, Mara said. Not all of them are the same. Rourke nodded. She had the quality of someone who understood the difference between patience and pressure and had learned when each one was the right tool. I'm not going to tell you it's risk-free. There are people associated with Steck who would prefer this investigation not proceed. The gray sedan, the parking structure. How long has someone been watching me? Mara said. Rourke's expression shifted, something tightening slightly, which told Mara the answer before the words did. We became aware you were on someone's radar approximately 3 weeks ago. We've had intermittent surveillance on your known location since then, for your protection. She paused. The vehicle in the parking structure this morning was ours. Mara absorbed that. The ghost she'd invented out of fatigue had been real, which meant her instincts hadn't been off. They'd been right, just pointed at the wrong source. The gray sedan, she said. Level 3. Yes. You could have told me. We didn't want to. Rourke stopped. We were managing the timing. I apologize for that. It wasn't a complete apology, and they both knew it. But Mara had been in enough institutional context to understand that incomplete apologies from people in Rourke's position were often the most honest kind. Give me the statement form, Mara said. She was in that room for 2 hours. She hadn't talked about the deployment in 4 years, and the experience of doing so was stranger than she'd expected. Not cathartic, nothing as clean as that, but clarifying in the way that naming something always clarified it. She told Rourke about the first incident, a medical response that Steck had overruled for reasons that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with optics. She told her about the soldiers. She told her about the after-action report she'd been required to sign that did not reflect what she had seen, and about the meeting 3 weeks later where a JAG officer had explained in careful institutional language that her contract renewal would not be proceeding and that she might find civilian life fulfilling. She told it without drama. Just the facts, sequenced, the same way she'd been documenting things for 3 years at Harlow General, as if someone might read it in a courtroom someday. When she was done, Rourke looked at her for a moment. You've been waiting to say that for a long time, she said. I've been waiting for it to matter, Mara said. Those are different things. She walked out of the consultation room at 2:15 and stood in the ICU corridor for a moment, recalibrating. The day shift was in full swing around her. The particular daytime register of a hospital, busier and louder than nights, more people, more movement. A nurse she didn't know well passed with a med cart and gave her a look that was becoming familiar, that slightly adjusted gaze, the half-second recalibration. She went to the bathroom, ran cold water over her wrists, and looked at herself in the mirror. She looked tired. She looked like someone who'd been awake for most of 30 hours, had performed emergency surgery by flashlight, been grabbed by the hair, had 4 institutional conversations, and had just handed over 4 years of suppressed testimony to a federal agent. She had a coffee stain on the sleeve of the navy blazer that she hadn't noticed until now. She was not okay in the fine and uncomplicated sense of the word. She was functional, which was different. She'd been functional through worse. She dried her hands and went back out. The 4 o'clock board meeting was not something she was supposed to attend. It was an administrative proceeding. Harlow General's executive board, legal counsel, the medical staff committee, and whatever institutional machinery got assembled when a 14-year chief of surgery became a liability overnight. She was a witness, a complainant in the formal sense, and parties in that position didn't sit in on their own cases. What she did have was Mercer, who texted her at 4:40 with updates she read from the waiting area outside the executive floor, where she'd been sitting with a cup of vending machine coffee since 3:30 because she had nowhere better to be and she needed to know. Motion to exclude footage denied. Board-ruled chain of custody was intact. Mercer's disclosure to the board was within his security authority. She breathed out slowly. 15 minutes later, Hale's counsel is arguing the assault was a reflexive physical response to a perceived clinical obstruction, not premeditated. She typed back, "His hand was in my hair for approximately 4 seconds before I responded." Does that read as reflexive? Board chair asked the same question, verbatim. Another 10 minutes. She drank the bad coffee. Hale discharged his legal team. She stopped moving. He asked to address the board directly. Without counsel. They're deciding whether to allow it. She put the phone face down on her knee and looked at the wall across from her. Institutional beige, a framed print of the Portland waterfront that had been there so long the colors had shifted toward yellow. She'd passed that print probably 400 times in 3 years and had never stopped to look at it before. She was looking at it now because she didn't know what to do with the information that Garrett Hale had fired his lawyers and was asking to speak for himself. Her phone buzzed. They're letting him speak. Look. She found out what he said from Mercer, in pieces, over the next 40 minutes. He'd stood in front of the board without notes. He'd confirmed Mara's account of the Bay to incident in complete and specific terms. Not the sanitized version his legal team had been constructing, but the real one, including details that hadn't appeared in any of the witness statements. He'd confirmed that he'd grabbed her. He'd confirmed that he'd done it with deliberate intent to remove her from a position he felt threatened by. He'd confirmed the words he'd used. You're a nurse. Follow orders. Not just from the previous night, but as a pattern going back 3 years. He'd listed, from memory, 5 specific incidents in which he had dismissed or overruled her clinical concerns in ways that he could now identify as professionally indefensible. He did not ask for leniency. What he asked for, according to Mercer's text, was that the board's reforms, whatever they decided, focus on structural change rather than individual punishment alone. That the culture that had allowed him to operate that way for 14 years without consequence was not a culture he had built alone. Mercer's final text on the subject read, "Board chair cried. I did not, but I understood the impulse." The formal outcomes came through an hour later in an official communication that Sandra Voigt sent to all clinical staff. Dr. Garrett Hale had voluntarily resigned as chief of trauma surgery, effective immediately. He had agreed to a supervised practice period pending medical board review and had voluntarily self-reported to the Oregon Medical Board with a full account of the incidents described in the proceeding. Criminal assault charges were being considered by the district attorney's office, and Hale had stated through the board that he would not contest them. The hospital was commissioning an independent review of trauma floor culture and nurse-physician power dynamics, with an external consultant and mandatory participation from all staff above a certain tenure. A formal reporting structure for nursing concerns, with real escalation pathways and documented response requirements, would be implemented within 60 days. There was a second paragraph that Voigt had clearly written herself rather than delegating to counsel. It was shorter, and it said, in language that was slightly less institutional than the rest of the document, that the events of the previous night had surfaced patterns that the hospital had failed to adequately address, and that the staff member whose clinical judgment and physical safety had been most directly affected deserved acknowledgement that the institution had not protected her as it should have. It didn't name her, but it didn't need to. Phil texted her 3 minutes after the announcement went out. You should see the floor right now." She didn't go to the floor. Not yet. She was still in the waiting area outside the executive suite, and she needed another minute of the bad coffee and the yellowed waterfront print before she could be in a room full of people who were looking at her differently than they had yesterday. The elevator down the hall opened and Hale walked out. He looked smaller than she'd ever seen him look. Not physically. He was still the same man, same height, same frame. But he moved without the particular ownership that had always surrounded him, the way certain people occupied space as though they'd reserved it in advance. That was gone. He was just a man in a corridor, carrying his jacket over one arm, walking toward whatever came next with the deliberate pace of someone who had made a decision and was now living inside it. He saw her. He stopped. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The corridor did its ordinary business around them. A nurse with a clipboard, an orderly pushing a linen cart, the building's indifferent daytime hum. "The DA," he said finally. "I'm told they're looking at a misdemeanor assault charge, possibly more depending on how they categorize it given the clinical environment." He said it flatly, like someone reading their own diagnosis. "I know," Mara said. "I'm not going to fight it. I know that too." He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. He stopped. "I want you to know that I understand what I did. Not just last night. The way I operated. I understand what it cost people." He looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. "I understand what it cost you specifically." She looked at him. The complicated thing about this moment was that it required her to hold two truths at once, that the damage was real and had accumulated over years, and that the man in front of her was something she hadn't anticipated him being, which was genuinely accountable, not performatively accountable, not legally strategic, but the thing itself. She could see the difference. She'd seen enough of both to know which was which. "Your daughter is going to have a hard recovery," she said. "She's going to need you present for it. Don't spend the next 6 months in courtrooms and committee hearings if you can avoid it." He looked at her with something that was close to not understanding what she was offering. Then, "Yes, I know." "Go be her father," Mara said. "Let the process be the process." He nodded once. Then he walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and was gone. She stood in the corridor for a moment. She felt the specific absence of something she'd been carrying, not forgiveness, she hadn't gotten there and might not, but the weight of waiting, the anticipation of consequence. For 3 years she'd documented and absorbed and waited, operating on the theory that eventually it would matter, and now it had mattered, and the feeling of that was less triumphant than she'd expected, and more simply finished, like a pressure that had been constant for so long she'd stopped feeling it until it released. She went to the floor at 6. The evening shift was coming on, and the trauma floor at 6 o'clock had the transitional quality of a place in the middle of becoming itself again. The acute chaos of the previous night metabolized, the patient stable or transferred or discharged, the ordinary business of medicine reasserting itself over the extraordinary business of surviving a crisis. Phil was at the charge desk. He looked at her and said, "You came back." "I'm not on tonight," she said. She paused. "I wanted to check on a few things." He nodded and didn't push it. She walked the floor once, the way she always walked it, checking in with her actual eyes, not just the chart, the specific habit she'd developed in the field and never lost. She stopped at the room where one of the bus accident patients, a woman named Deborah, 56, 3 broken ribs and a wrist fracture, was sitting up watching television and knocked on the open door. "How's the pain?" Mara asked. Deborah looked at her. "Better than last night." A pause. "You were there last night, weren't you? I remember your face." "I was here, yeah." "You gave me that blanket," Deborah said. "When they had me in the hallway waiting, you brought me an extra blanket without me asking." Mara had no memory of this. She'd probably done it automatically, the way she did a dozen small things each shift without tracking them. "I'm glad it helped." "You have no idea what that meant," Deborah said. She said it simply, without the weight of significance, just as a fact. When you're scared and cold and you don't know what's happening, someone bringing you a blanket without you asking it tells you something. What does it tell you? That somebody actually sees you. Deborah looked at the window. Not just your chart. Mara thought about that for a moment, about the specific quality of being seen versus being processed, about the 3 years she'd spent making herself invisible to stay safe, and all the ways she'd made herself visible to the people who needed her to be. The patient in bed 4, the boy in bay 6, Tomas at 3 in the morning with the number she'd given him years ago because she'd understood that sometimes the only way to do the right thing was outside the official channel. She said goodnight to Deborah and kept walking. She was near the end of the corridor, close to the exit, when Dominic fell into step beside her. He was on tonight, apparently. Fresh scrubs, less destroyed than he'd looked at 5:30 in the morning. Dr. Anand asked me something this afternoon, he said. They were walking side by side, and he was looking straight ahead, which made it easier. She asked me how I decided to bag the patient when you called it in Bay 2. She was doing some kind of debrief thing. What did you tell her? I told her you said it like you'd already decided, he said. Like it wasn't a question. He paused. She said that's a specific skill, communicating clinical certainty. She asked if I had observed it before in a nursing staff member. Mara said nothing. I said honestly no, he said. I hadn't. Not like that. He paused again, working up to something. I've been thinking about why that is. Why I was so ready to defer to Hale and not to you, when the information you had was at least as good. He said it with the specific discomfort of someone examining their own software and finding code they don't like. I don't have a clean answer for it. The clean answer is that you were trained in a system that gave you a clear hierarchy, Mara said, and you used it. The hierarchy was wrong. It's been wrong for a long time, she said. That's not your fault individually. It's still your problem going forward. He thought about that. Is that how you dealt with it for 3 years? No, she said honestly. For 3 years, I documented everything and stayed out of the way and hoped I wouldn't have to do anything dramatic. She looked at him briefly. That didn't work. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, more the expression of someone absorbing a lesson that arrived sideways. They reached the exit. She pushed through into the evening air. Portland at 6 o'clock after a storm had a particular quality. Everything damp and cooling, the light at a low angle, the city resuming its ordinary business with the slightly heightened quality that came after a night when things had broken and then been managed. She could see a slice of the river from the hospital entrance, silver in the late light. Her phone rang. The number was one she'd called this morning. The JAG contact, Lieutenant Hargrove, who she'd been avoiding since before noon. She answered it. Mara. His voice was familiar. She'd known him at Bragg, a lawyer who'd always been more honest with her than the institution he represented. I've been trying to reach you. I know. I was in the middle of something. I heard, he said. Some of it, anyway. Rourke contacted us after your meeting this morning. A pause. I need you to understand something about the statement you gave her. Okay. Stex people know you talked, Hargrove said. That happened faster than anyone expected. There are 3 other witnesses in this investigation, and none of them have been surfaced yet, but you were identified this morning specifically because of what happened last night at your hospital. You became visible, and that visibility reached people who've been monitoring this investigation. She looked at the river. What does that mean practically, she said. It means the protective measures that Rourke's team put in place are being escalated, he said. It also means... He stopped. The pause had a texture to it that she recognized, the texture of something difficult that a careful person was deciding how to frame. Steck filed a legal challenge this afternoon to block the investigation on procedural grounds. Standard delay tactic, but in the filing his team submitted a document. She waited. It's a disciplinary record, Hargrove said. From your military service? Mara, it's fabricated. We know it's fabricated because we have the original file. But it's going to be circulated, and before we can formally contest it, it's going to land somewhere public. The evening air felt colder than it had a moment ago. What does it say? She said. It alleges that your separation from service was not voluntary, that you were formally disciplined for insubordination, and that your clinical judgment was flagged as compromised in a fitness review. He said it quickly, efficiently, the way you said things that needed to be said without softening. It's completely false. But it will be out there before we can contest it. She stood on the hospital steps with the phone to her ear and did the math. A fabricated disciplinary record, timed to drop at the exact moment her name was appearing in the Harlow General Investigation, in the assault case, in the Pruitt story that Tomas had mentioned spreading through the paramedic network. Time to arrive while she was most visible and most vulnerable to having her credibility eroded. It was not clumsy. Whoever had designed it understood the leverage point precisely. "How long do we have before it's public?" she said. "We think 12 hours, Hargrove said. "Maybe less." She looked at the door she'd just come out of. The hospital behind her, the investigation in progress, the board meeting just concluded. The 8 nurses whose statements were now on the record, the footage that had survived the exclusion motion, everything she'd spent the day building, and the specific tool designed to dismantle it. "What do I do?" she said. "Honestly," Hargrove said, "you get ahead of it. You tell your story before the document tells it for you." She looked at the river. 12 hours. "I need to make a call," she said, and hung up. She stood there for 30 seconds, running the options. Then she went back inside. Mercer was still in the building. She'd seen his car in the lot. She found him in his office on the second floor, jacket off, looking like a man who had also been awake for 36 hours and was running on institutional responsibility and bad vending machine coffee. She sat down across from him without being invited. "Someone is about to release a fabricated military disciplinary record with my name on it," she said, "designed to land while the Harlow investigation is open and the assault case is active." Mercer looked at her for a long moment. Then he leaned back in his chair. "Steck? His team? Yes." "How long?" 12 hours, maybe." He was quiet for a moment. The office was small and functional, the desk covered in the specific archaeology of a man who dealt in institutional reality. Incident reports, contact sheets, legal correspondence. On the corner of the desk, she noticed, was a photograph of 2 soldiers in BDS. Neither of them was Mercer, but the framing of the photo, the particular way it was positioned, slightly turned toward the chair, not toward the room, said something about who he was and what he held on to. "You need to be on record first," he said, "with your actual service record, formally verified, formally submitted." "I know. I have contacts at the Army Board for Correction of Military Records," he said. "I also know 2 journalists, one at the Oregonian, one at a national wire service, who have been working the Harlow story since this morning." He looked at her steadily. "If you authorize your verified record to be released alongside a response to whatever Steck's team puts out, you control the frame." "If I do that," she said, "everything comes out. The deployments, the incidents, the reason I left." "Yes," he said, "it does." She looked at the photograph on the corner of his desk. She thought about the 2 soldiers in it, whoever they were, and about the one she'd lost, and about the specific way she'd been carrying all of it. Not buried exactly, but held close, in the private way of someone who understood that some things got weaponized when they reached daylight. They'd been weaponized anyway, against her will, without her consent, before she was ready. "All right," she said. She pulled out her phone and called Hargrove back. "I'm going to release my record," she said when he answered. "Verified and complete. I need the official documentation formally authorized within 8 hours." A pause on his end. Then, "I can do that. And I need the name of whoever is going to receive the fabricated record. Which journalist, which outlet, which channel, before it lands." A longer pause. "Mara, that's not information I'm supposed to—" "I'm not asking you to stop it," she said. "I'm asking you to tell me where it's going so I can make sure my actual record arrives at the same desk at the same time." The pause stretched. Then, "Give me 2 hours." She hung up. Mercer was looking at her with the expression she'd come to associate with him. Not surprised exactly, but recalibrating. The look of someone updating their understanding of what a person was made of. "You know what this means," he said, "for the quiet life you built here." "The quiet life ended yesterday," she said. "I'm just deciding how the next one starts." Her phone buzzed on the table between them. She looked down. A text from a number she didn't recognize, no contact name, with a Portland area code she didn't know. It said, "We know you talked to Rourke. Stop now, and this ends here. One chance." She looked at it for a long moment. Then she turned the phone face up so Mercer could see it, screenshot it, and set it back down. "I'm going to need that in the record," she said, and her phone buzzed again, this time with a photo. A photograph of her. Taken from a distance, the framing familiar, the location recognizable as the hospital steps she'd been standing on 20 minutes ago when she was on the phone with Hargrove. Taken from a gray sedan parked at the far end of the lot. Not Rourke's people. The other kind. Mercer looked at the photograph on her phone for 3 seconds. Then he picked up his desk phone, not his cell, the landline, and made a call that lasted 45 seconds and consisted almost entirely of him reading out a license plate number he'd pulled up on his security system before she'd even asked how he got it. He hung up and said, "Rourke's team has the plate. They're running it now." "How did you—" "External cameras cover the lot to the property line." He turned the monitor toward her, 4 angles, timestamp running in the corner. The gray sedan was visible on camera 2, parked at the far edge, engine running. As they watched, it pulled out and left. "They know we made them," Mara said. "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "Which means the 12-hour window just got shorter." She was already standing. "I need a room with a computer and a phone that isn't mine." He pointed to the door across the hall. "Conference room. Use the landline. I'll get you into the secure network." She spent the next 4 hours in that room. What happened in those 4 hours was not dramatic in the way that things had been dramatic for the previous 24. It was the other kind of hard work. The grinding, careful, unglamorous kind that didn't look like anything from the outside. Phone calls, emails, coordinating with Hargrove on the official release of her verified service record through the Army's formal channels. Coordinating with Mercer on Harlow General's legal team, who needed to understand what was coming and needed to be positioned to respond. A 40-minute call with Rourke, who had identified the license plate as belonging to a private security contractor with documented ties to 2 of Steck's former business associates, which was not proof of anything in a court, but was exactly the kind of thread that federal investigators knew how to pull. At 9:15, Hargrove called back with the name of the journalist. His name was Kevin Falk. He worked for a wire service with national distribution, and he'd received the fabricated disciplinary record by encrypted email at 8:47 that evening, sent from an anonymized address that Rourke's team was already tracing. Hargrove had a contact at the wire service, a legal affairs editor who understood what a fabricated federal document looked like and what it meant to publish one. "He's holding the story," Hargrove said, "for now, but he wants to talk to you." "Give him this number," Mara said. Falk called 11 minutes later. He was direct, which she appreciated. "I have a document purporting to be a disciplinary record from your military service," he said. "I also have, through your JAG contact, a certified copy of your actual service record, which does not match the document I received in several significant ways." A pause. "I want to understand what I'm looking at." "You're looking at a fabricated record created to discredit a witness in a federal investigation," she said, "and time to drop while I'm involved in a separate hospital case that's been generating coverage." "Who fabricated it?" "The investigation will establish that. What I can tell you is the factual discrepancies between the document you received and the verified record, and I can tell you why those discrepancies exist and who benefits from them." She talked to him for 35 minutes. She was careful. She had no interest in becoming the story herself, in the way that people became stories when they started leading with grievance instead of fact. She gave him the factual record, the timeline, the specific elements of the falsified document that didn't match reality, and the context of the Steck investigation without detail she wasn't authorized to provide. She gave it to him the way she gave everything, as if someone would read it in a courtroom someday. At the end, Falk said, "Miss Solis, your verified record shows a silver star and 2 commendations for battlefield medicine under hostile conditions. The document I received alleges insubordination and compromised clinical judgment." "Yes," she said. "That's not a subtle fabrication." "No," she said, "it isn't, which tells you something about how confident they were that no one would check." A pause. "They didn't count on you talking." "They didn't count on a lot of things," she said. She hung up. At 11:40, Falk published a story. Not about her specifically, about the fabricated document, its origins as best as could be traced at that point, its connection to the federal investigation into Steck, and the pattern of witness intimidation that Rourke's team was now formally characterizing on the record. Mara's name appeared in it once, in a single paragraph that described her as a decorated combat medic and civilian nurse who had provided testimony in the investigation and subsequently received threatening communications. It was accurate. It was measured. It put the frame exactly where she needed it before Steck's version could get there first. She read it in Mercer's conference room at 11:50 and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not relief, not triumph, but something closer to the feeling she'd had at Cassidy Hale's bedside when the oxygen number climbed. The feeling of a thing done right, of having done what was in front of her and having it hold. Mercer knocked on the conference room door and opened it without waiting for an answer, which was a habit she'd noticed about him. "Rourke just called," he said. The plate came back. The contractor is flagged in 2 other federal cases, both connected to Steck's network. She's issuing a formal protection advisory. He paused. "Mara, this is moving fast now." "I know." "You should go home. With company." He said it practically, not dramatically. "I can have a security person with you tonight." "I don't need—" "You do," he said, simply. "Not because you can't handle it, because you shouldn't have to do it alone." She looked at him. He was right, and she knew it, and the specific difficulty of accepting help was something she'd been navigating her whole adult life. The tension between capability and the particular exhaustion of operating as though you had no needs because other people needed you to. "Okay," she said. She slept. Not well. Not long. But she slept. Which was more than she'd expected, and when she woke at 6 in the morning, the city outside her window was doing its quiet thing. The early light, the wet streets, the particular stillness before the day started making its demands. She lay there for a while, not moving. The previous 36 hours had a quality she was still processing. Not the events themselves, which she'd catalogued while they happened with the trained precision of someone who documented things professionally, but the aggregate of them. The specific way a life could shift when the thing you'd been managing in silence stopped being manageable. She'd built the last 3 years around a very careful architecture of staying useful and staying invisible. And that architecture was gone now, and she was lying in her own bed in the early morning light trying to figure out what came next without the familiar weight of it. What came next was a phone call at 7 from Sandra Voigt. "I'll keep this brief," Voigt said. "The board met again this morning for a 30-minute emergency session. We have a proposal, and I want to give it to you before it becomes formal so you can tell me if it's wrong." Mara sat up. "Okay." "We want to create a position," Voigt said. "It doesn't have a title yet, which is partly intentional. It would involve clinical training, specifically trauma response and high-acuity nursing procedures, including non-standard interventions, teaching nursing staff and residents, developing protocols that incorporate field medicine approaches for mass casualty and high-complexity scenarios." A pause. "It's not a desk job. You'd be on the floor half the time, but you'd also be the person who shapes how we train for what the floor looks like when everything breaks at once." Mara was quiet for a moment. "It came out of the culture review," Voigt continued, "but also out of watching what you did on Tuesday night, not just the airway, all of it. The way you moved through that floor for 8 hours after the incident, the things you caught that the system didn't." "I have an active federal matter," Mara said. "That's going to be part of my life for the foreseeable future." "We know. We're not asking you to resolve that first." A pause. "We're asking you to stay." She looked at the light on her ceiling. The particular color of early morning in Portland, gray gold, always slightly uncertain, always, somehow, there. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I'm asking," Voigt said. The Steck investigation broke publicly 3 weeks later. She was on shift when it happened. Day shift now. A change she'd made because the position Voigt had proposed was taking shape, and it required overlap with the residents who mostly trained during days. She heard about it the way she heard about most things that weren't directly in front of her, from Phil Okoro, who appeared at her elbow at 2 in the afternoon with his phone turned toward her. The wire service story had Steck's name in the headline. The subheadline mentioned a federal indictment on charges including obstruction of justice, falsification of military records, and witness intimidation. There were 4 counts. The indictment named 2 co-defendants from his private security network, one of whom, the story noted, had been identified through a license plate traced to a hospital parking lot in Portland, Oregon. Phil read it twice. Then he looked at her. "Is this—" "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly. He was processing something. She could see it. The specific recalibration that happened when a person understood that the quiet colleague they'd spent 3 years mildly underestimating had been navigating something that had nothing to do with being quiet. "You never said anything," he said. "There wasn't anything to say," she said. "Until there was." She went back to the chart she'd been updating. Phil stood there for another moment, then, "For what it's worth, and I know it might not be much, because I should have asked this a long time ago. Are you okay?" She thought about the question, actually thought about it, instead of answering automatically. "I'm working on it," she said, "which is better than where I was." He nodded. That was enough for both of them. Hot tip. Garrett Hale pled guilty to misdemeanor assault in the 5th week after the incident. He did it in open court, without a trial, which meant there was no extended proceeding and no extended media coverage. Just a courtroom, a judge, a statement, and a sentence. Mandatory anger management, a professional development requirement, and a 2-year supervised practice restriction that the Oregon Medical Board had imposed separately in addition to the court's conditions. He had no admitting privileges at Harlow General. He was practicing under supervision at a smaller clinic in the East Side, Mercer told her, doing general medicine work, seeing patients who mostly needed someone to actually listen to them. Mara wasn't in the courtroom. She heard about it from Hargrove, who called her afterward and gave her the facts in the same direct way he'd been giving her facts for the past month. "How do you feel about it?" he asked at the end. It was the second time in a month someone had asked her that question and actually expected an answer. "Complicated," she said honestly. "He hurt people for a long time. The accountability is real. But I watched him choose it, watched him decide to stop fighting it, and I don't know what to do with that." She paused. "I think I'm still figuring out the difference between consequence and punishment, whether those are the same thing or whether they can be different and both be right." "That's going to take more than 5 weeks," Hargrove said. "I know." "For what it's worth," he said, "the patients whose cases were reviewed by the medical board, the ones where his overruled concerns possibly contributed to worse outcomes, 3 of those families have been contacted. The hospital is addressing it directly." A pause. "Your documentation made that possible. 3 years of time-stamped notes." She stood in the Harlow General break room with the phone to her ear, looking at the same bad coffee machine she'd been looking at for 3 years. "I know," she said. She'd known it might matter someday. She'd kept doing it anyway, on the days when it felt pointless, on the days when she put a detailed clinical note into a chart that nobody would read and walked away feeling like she was building something in a room with no windows and no one watching. The discipline of documentation as an act of faith in eventual consequence, even when consequence felt very far away. It had mattered, not in the way she'd imagined. She hadn't imagined anything in particular, had tried not to, because imagining outcomes was a way of building attachment to specific versions of justice that reality couldn't be trusted to deliver. But it had mattered in the way that real things mattered, imperfectly, belatedly, and more completely than silence would have allowed. Cassidy Hale was discharged from Harlow General on a Tuesday morning, 31 days after she arrived on a gurney with an oxygen saturation of 61%. Mara happened to be on the floor when it happened, not by arrangement, just by the ordinary rhythm of being somewhere when something occurs. She was at the nurse's station when she heard the elevator, and when she looked up, Cassidy was coming down the corridor in regular clothes for the first time, moving carefully, with a neck brace and a slight hesitation in her gait that would be there for a while yet, and her father walking beside her with his hand not quite touching her elbow, close enough to catch her if she needed it, not so close as to take away the fact of her doing it herself. Cassidy saw Mara from 10 feet away. She stopped walking. Garrett Hale stopped too, and looked at Mara, and then stepped back slightly, not retreating, just making space, the body language of someone who understood that the moment didn't belong to him. Cassidy walked the remaining 10 feet alone. She was 21 years old, and she had been through something that would leave marks she couldn't fully see yet, and she looked at Mara with the particular directness of someone who had spent 31 days thinking about this moment. I was awake for part of it, she said. The beginning, before they sedated me. I heard your voice. Mara didn't say anything. You were very calm, Cassidy said. Scary calm, but it was the right kind of scary, like someone who knew where they were going. She swallowed. I didn't know if I was going to make it. And then your voice was there, and it sounded like you'd already decided I was. Mara looked at her, at the trach scar below her jaw, still pink, still fresh, at the young woman who had been a number on a monitor and red emergency light and was now standing in a hospital corridor in her own shoes. You had a strong recovery, Mara said. That was you. That was both of us, Cassidy said, firmly, not leaving it open for revision. She held out her hand. Mara shook it. It was the kind of handshake that meant more than handshakes usually meant, not because of theater or ceremony, but because of the specific weight of what two people had been through in the same room on the same night and survived from different angles. I'm going back to school in the fall, Cassidy said. Pre-med. A pause. I've been thinking a lot about what kind of doctor I want to be. What kind? The kind that listens to the nurses, she said, straight, no performance to it. She walked to the elevator with her father. He looked back once, at the doorway, looked at Mara with the expression of a man who no longer had the language for what he owed and had stopped pretending he did. She nodded once. The elevator closed. Phil Okoro appeared beside her. You know, he said, I've been on this floor for 11 years. I know. I've seen a lot of things. He was quiet for a moment. I don't think I've ever seen someone work the way you work. The whole picture, not just the piece that's in front of you. He paused, in the way of someone who finds directness slightly uncomfortable but is attempting it anyway. I think I spent 3 years assuming you were just methodical, careful, good at your job. He stopped. I didn't understand what I was looking at. Phil, I'm not trying to make it into something it's not, he said. I just think, when you take that new position, whenever it starts, the people you train are going to be better because of it. And I wanted to say that before it becomes official or whatever, before it's the thing everyone says. He looked at the elevator where Cassidy had been. I wanted to say it when it was just us. She looked at him. 11 years on this floor, decent man, someone who'd absorbed his own compromises the way everyone absorbed them and was, she thought, genuinely trying to absorb them differently now. Thank you, she said, and meant it without reservation. She accepted the position formally on a Wednesday afternoon. The paperwork was unremarkable. A new contract, a new title they'd eventually landed on, clinical training coordinator, trauma and emergency medicine, and a start date 6 weeks out to give her time to prepare material and wind down her current patient assignments. She signed it in Voigt's office with Voigt and the nursing director present, and afterward they offered her coffee, and she accepted it, and they sat in the office and talked for 20 minutes about the training curriculum with the slightly tentative enthusiasm of people who were building something they hadn't built before. It was not a triumphant scene. There was no ceremony. The coffee was the same institutional quality as the break room, and the nursing director had a cold and kept apologizing for it, and at one point Mara's phone buzzed with a text from Tomas asking if she wanted to grab food after work, which was the most normal thing that had happened to her in 6 weeks. She texted back, yes, somewhere with actual heat. She walked out of Voigt's office and down the corridor toward the floor, and as she walked, she passed the nurses' station where 3 nurses she'd worked nights with for years were in the middle of a handoff conversation. One of them, a woman named Priya, who had been at Harlow longer than Mara and had her own catalog of absorbed compromises, looked up. Hey, Priya said, we heard you signed. Just now. Priya looked at her for a moment with the direct appraisal of someone who had watched the last 6 weeks from the inside. Good, she said, not effusively, just good. The word as a complete sentence. Mara kept walking. She thought about what it meant to be seen, not in the abstract. She had no patience for the abstract when the concrete was this available. She thought about it specifically, about the 3 years she had made herself invisible in this building, and about the fact that invisibility had not, in the end, protected her. It had just meant that when the moment came, when there was no option left but to be visible, she'd had to do it all at once, in a trauma bay, under red emergency lighting, with someone's hand in her hair. She'd rather have done it differently. She would not tell you that it was better the way it happened, or that the hardship was worth it in some clean accounting. That was the language of people who needed suffering to have a lesson at the end, and she'd learned to distrust that need. Sometimes the lesson was just, it shouldn't have been this hard. And that was true. And it was worth saying plainly, and it didn't cancel out the fact that she was still here. What she believed, not confidently, not cleanly, but in the tentative way that you believe things you'd tested against reality and found they held, was this: that the work mattered even when no one saw it, that the documentation was worth doing even when no one read it, that the small acts, the extra blanket, the phone call to Tomas, the careful note in the chart at 2 a.m, accumulated into something, not because the universe was fair, but because enough people paying enough attention could eventually build the conditions for accountability. It was slow. It was imperfect. It required people like Mercer, who had done his own version of the long, patient work. It required residents like Dominic, who were willing to look at their own software and dislike what they found and try to change it. It required Tomas in his rig at 3 a.m. with nitro on standby because a nurse had called him 7 years ago after a bad shift and asked him what his protocols were, and he'd answered, and something had been built. She'd been underestimated for 3 years, not just by Hale, by the institution, by the culture, by the particular hierarchy that had learned to read her stillness as absence rather than as the thing it actually was, which was presence of a different register. The underestimation had cost her. She wasn't going to pretend it hadn't. But it had not diminished the thing itself. The judgment, the skill, the knowledge that lived in her hands and her mind, and the 3-second muscle memory that put a surgeon on the floor when he had it coming. You could ignore a thing. You could dismiss it, mock it, pull it backward by the hair. You could not make it not exist. That was the only thing she'd stake a claim to. Not heroism, not triumph, not the tidy redemption arc. Just the stubborn, factual persistence of being exactly what she was. In the dark, under bad lighting, with improvised tools and the particular unshakable calm that came from having made decisions like this before and having them hold. 6 weeks later, she walked into her first training session. 8 nurses. 2 residents, including Dominic, who had specifically requested the course. 1 attending from the emergency department who had emailed her 3 times in the preceding month with questions about field medicine that she'd answered, and who had then emailed to ask if she was taking observers. She was. She'd prepared materials because she prepared things. She had a curriculum structure and learning objectives and case studies drawn from real scenarios. Anonymized, clinical, the way you taught things when you wanted people to learn the procedure and not the drama. She had a section on documentation that was the longest section in the course, because documentation was the thing that made everything else matter, eventually. She stood at the front of the room and looked at the 8 nurses and 2 residents and 1 attending. She thought about what to say first. She thought about the break room conversation with Mercer and the parking structure conversation with Cassidy's mother and the 35 minutes on the phone with a journalist making sure the true record arrived at the same desk as the false one. She thought about Wallace Pruitt eating a hospital breakfast and not knowing her name. She thought about Marcus in his hospital bed, watching cartoons with his grandmother's hand around his. She thought about what Phil had said. I didn't understand what I was looking at. She thought about what she wanted these people to look at differently. The first thing I want you to understand, she said, is that the most dangerous moment in a high acuity situation isn't when the monitors alarm. It's the moment before that, when something is wrong but the numbers haven't caught up yet. And the only thing between the patient and a bad outcome is whether someone in that room is paying attention. The room was quiet. Most of the time, she said, that person is you. Not the attending, not the specialist on the phone. You, the nurse who has been in that room for 3 hours and has seen the thing change in a way you can't fully articulate yet, but can see. She paused. I'm going to teach you how to articulate it. And I'm going to teach you what to do with it when the person with more institutional authority decides not to hear it. Dominic was looking at her with the expression she'd seen develop in him over the past 6 weeks. The expression of someone who had undergone a genuine recalibration and was still discovering its edges. Because here's the thing about authority, she said. In a crisis, It belongs to whoever knows what to do next. That's not a feeling. That's not confidence. It's competence. And competence doesn't come with a title. She looked at the room. You build it. You document it. You defend it. You do it again tomorrow. She opened the first case study. They got to work. Outside the training room windows, Portland was doing what it did in late autumn. Rain moving in off the coast, the light going early, the bridges glowing over the river in the early dark. The city had the quality it always had when the weather turned. Smaller and closer and more itself, the way cities contracted into their own particular character when the elements reminded them they were embedded in something larger. Inside, 8 nurses and 2 residents and 1 attending were learning to read a rhythm strip the way she'd learned to read one. Not as numbers, but as language. The body's way of saying something is changing here, something is changing here. Are you listening? Mara stood at the front of the room, and for the first time in 3 years, she was not invisible. Not because she'd been revealed, not because a crisis had stripped her cover away and left her exposed in the light, but because she'd chosen it, chosen to take up the space, use the name, stand in the front of the room and say, "This is what I know, and it is worth knowing, and I am going to give it to you so that when I'm not in the room, something of what I built will still be there." That was the work. Not the single heroic moment, not the airway in the dark, not the 3 seconds on the trauma bay floor, not the phone call at 2 a.m. that reached a man before he died in his own bed. Those things had happened. They mattered. But they were points in a line that stretched in both directions, back into deployments she still couldn't fully talk about, and forward into rooms like this one, where the line continued through other people, other hands, other 3 a.m. decisions made by nurses who had learned to trust the thing they saw before the numbers confirmed it. She had been built by hard things, not broken by them. Built. And the building was still happening, not behind walls this time, not in the careful architecture of invisibility, but here, in the open, with her name on a contract and her voice in a room full of people who had come to learn something she had spent a lifetime not knowing she was allowed to teach. The rain came down outside. The lights held. She kept going.